I want to really thank all of the departments and orgs who contributed to bringing Breeze out here today. Africana Studies, Women's Studies, Geography, and Vassar Association of Class Activists, Animal Rights Coalition, and Grassroots Alliance for Alternative Politics, and Feminist Alliance. Thank you so much. And I'm just going to introduce Breeze. Breeze Harper is a doctoral candidate in geography at University of California, Davis. Her work focuses on questions of how race, class, gender, and geographical region affect community health and well-being and relationship with and perceptions of alternative consumption practices like veganism. Her work has appeared in The Black Imagination, Science Fiction and Futurism, Taking Food Public, Redefining Foodways in a Changing World, and Journal of Critical Animal Studies. And her dissertation is entitled Sociospatial Epistemologies of Racialized Consciousness, Critical Race and Black Feminist Analysis of Vegan Praxis in the USA. I'm so excited to welcome Breeze to Vassar. And without further ado, thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I'm going to try to talk as loud as possible. I traveled from the West Coast about 2 weeks ago with a newborn, and she got something and gave it to me, so I'm going to talk as much as I can without losing my voice, as loud as I can. I usually sing, and I could attempt to sing with laryngitis coming on, so I'm going to do it anyway, to kind of get people, used to conveying information through music. So I kind of start off with this song, We Are the Ones We've Been Waiting For, and it's kind of what has driven me to put together my project, the Sister Vegan Project, which started about 6 years ago, kind of looking at what it means to be a Black woman in this country and then practice veganism and just kind of all of the intersections of race and class and gender, and kind of understanding that collectively Black women are the ones that we've been waiting for to kind of bring on change. So I'm going to do it anyway, even if my voice is, failing me. We are the ones, we've been waiting. We are the ones, we've been waiting. We are the ones we've been waiting for. We are the ones we've been waiting. We are the ones we've been waiting. We are the ones we've been waiting for. We are the ones, we will not bow down to racism. We will not bow down to injustice. We will not bow down to exploitation. I'm gonna stand. I'm gonna stand. And that's the song to Panther soundtrack from like 1996, a collaboration. So those are kind of the themes that I bring into my work. And since I can't sing my dissertation, I like to at least somehow convey different ways of knowledge through more than just writing. So I just wanted to greet you with that particular type of knowledge system, music, singing, just as a premise to going into what I'm going to read to you tonight, which is a part of my chapter for my dissertation that I'm working on. It started off 42 pages. I chopped it down to 23. So it's not actually complete. So some things that I may say you may not understand is because I couldn't put everything in there. So that can be for the Q&A session after. If I say a term they don't understand and I didn't expand upon it, you can just say during the Q&A, what did you mean by this? And I'll try to do my best to explain. But it is a work in progress. So this is from chapter 3 of my dissertation. And Galen had said that I'm basically doing work which is critical race theory applied to geography, and then kind of looking at veganism and the ethical consumption movement. And in particular, I'm really interested in how whiteness manifests in the vegan movement, the mainstream vegan movement. So this is titled White Talk, Discursive Violence, and Dysconscious Racism, From Vegan Consciousness to Vegan Commodity. In October of 2007, I was invited to Princeton University to speak on a pause panel with Princeton professors Russ Neely and Peter Singer. The panel focused on whether the 2007 second iteration of PETA's Animal Liberation Project, which parallels images of non-human animal suffering to human suffering, was appropriate. Several times throughout the open discussion about animal rights, morality, and ethics, the two men referenced Eurocentric-based philosophies that drove their rationale and praxis of animal rights rhetoric. Both Singer and Neely appeared to believe that the Eurocentric ethics and morals that drove their philosophies of animal rights are universally applicable to all people. Now, eventually, I asked the two how their pro-vegan and pro-vegetarian logic could apply to everyone, since their philosophical foundations came from a standpoint of men who had never viscerally experienced being a non-white racialized subject in the USA. In response to my question, Dr. Neely stated that I was gendering and racializing the pure concepts of ethics and morality. Now, for me, telling a black woman that her question about race and gender is basically irrelevant re-inscribed this particular pro-vegan and animal liberation space as white, male, and paternalistic. Singer never questioned Neely's statement, which implies that he found nothing ethically wrong with such a statement. I interpret silence from such a famous and powerful Princeton professor as he being compliant with Neely. Neely's response and Singer's silence became an example of how paternalism and authoritative whiteness operated within the consciousness of two men who believe that they are ethical and moral, while simultaneously dismissing the relevancy of my question. Interestingly, however, Peter Singer's writing has shown him to be an anti-racist proponent, condemning speciesism, sexism, and racism. As a matter of fact, Singer's book, Animal Liberation, set the groundwork for a type of post-1970s animal liberation framing that integrated intersections of all oppressions, never before seen in Western scholarship about animal liberation. However, I argue that white people collectively who claim to be anti-racist can still fall into the trap of defining their supposed anti-racism within the context of what Bonilla Silva and Zubright call white logic, and what Robin Wigman calls liberal whiteness, and she describes this as, quote, "By speaking of logic, we refer to both the foundation of the techniques used in analyzing empirical reality and the reasoning used by researchers in their efforts to understand society. White logic then refers to a context in which white supremacy has defined the techniques and processes of reasoning about social facts." End quote. Secondly, in terms of neoliberal whiteness, Wigman analyzes, and she begins the quote, "The white neoliberal desire to produce an anti-racist white subject disaffiliated from the deployments of white privilege and authority. She outlines the ways in which neoliberalism seeks to disconnect itself from its white supremacist history by rearticulating an anti-racist counter-whiteness. The latter aims to differentiate itself from white supremacy by particularizing itself. It thereby insists upon the definitive discontinuity of its own enterprise of that of white supremacy." End quote. Though the term white supremacy is often associated with KKK and Nazi youth movement in the USA, white supremacy can also include how white male elite ontological perspectives dominate the production of social facts, as what counts as anti-racism and what does not. Usually there is a disagreement about what counts as anti-racism between the collectivity of white male elite philosophical canon and the non-white racialized subjects, such as Black Americans. Hence, I argue that the silence of Singer was part of a larger system of exclusion that works to maintain white privilege. When Neely responded that my question was racializing and gendering the purity of morals and ethics, he was speaking from the place and social position of gatekeeper of white Eurocentric philosophical canon. This canon is a site of white racial epistemological privilege and ignores the fact that we are racialized beings. In this sense, whiteness is visible as privilege. That is, the ability to ignore race and the impact it has had on the formation of social consciousness in the West is a sign of white privilege. Therefore, with Neely's logic, dialogues about how embodied experiences of race, racism, gender, and sexism, and how it affects pro-vegan and vegetarian moral logic would make the supposed sacred space of pure Western philosophical canon impure. To better articulate how this fusion of purity and moral logic operates within pro-vegan and pro-vegetarian rhetoric, I turn to John T. Warren's book, Performing Purity, Whiteness, Pedagogy, and the Reconstitution of Power. Warren grounds his understanding of whiteness as a discursive process and performance. Anchoring his work in Judith Butler's articulation of gender as a bodily and discursive act, Warren uses her as a model to explore how whiteness becomes a performance through communication. Looking beyond the materiality of the body as a site of whiteness, he argues that whiteness is also discursively performed through white rhetoric. White studies scholar Ruth Frankenberg has referred to this as white talk, or the rhetorical body of whiteness, which functions as a discourse, a fluid sea of values, beliefs, and practices that individuals draw upon, consciously and unconsciously, to exert cultural power and maintain a racial system that keeps whiteness safe as the cultural center. Now, those such as myself who seek to expose the race and gender construction of knowledge production within traditional white Eurocentric moral philosophical canon are socially placed as impure thinkers because we choose to expose this rhetorical body of whiteness. Now, Neely's response and Singer's silence join forces to maintain the discursive power of whiteness within two simultaneous pro-vegan and pro-vegetarian spaces. Number one, the physical location of the event, and number two, the discursive space of the European philosophical canon that has been so central to US mainstream post-1970s animal defense and pro-vegan literature. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not suggesting that white middle-class scholars should not be allowed to produce philosophies about ethics or morality through a Eurocentric mainstream framework. Singer's seminal book, Animal Liberation, exposed thousands of people worldwide to the suffering that human beings cause to the non-human animal world, and revealed him to be a strong advocate against covert and physical forms of violence, physical violence of racism. However, I do become concerned with the racial class status quo in the USA, engage in pro-vegan and pro-vegetarian activism, ignore that their epistemologies are racialized, and instead believe that they are universal. Critical race scholars Joyce King, Karen Sira, and Helen Anderson theorize that the collectivity of white people in the USA engage in something called violent consciousness that operates as something called Dysconscious racism. King argues that it is not the absence of consciousness, but an impaired consciousness or distorted way of thinking about race, as compared to, for example, critical consciousness. Furthermore, what is particularly interesting about King, Sarah, and Anderson's engagement with the theory of violent consciousness is that they lay the groundwork for me to see how the rhetoric of veganism as peaceful, nonviolent, and cruelty-free operates among certain high-profile whites who are performing dysconscious racism. The very definition of veganism by the American Vegan Society is rooted in the concept of ahimsa, which means anti-violence and harmlessness. Of course, how one engages in an ahimsa-based life is subjective and up to individual interpretation. However, Sira and Anderson look at ahimsa beyond physical acts of violence, and they look at it, quote, toward an understanding of violence that also includes the harm of failing to interrogate the lenses through which we see, lenses that simultaneously make visible and obscure. This latter understanding of harm is what we refer to as violent consciousness, which we assert is a central component of the phenomena of dysconsciousness, arrogant perception, and normalization, end quote. I would argue that even though Neely does not participate in the violence of eating and or killing non-human animals, his response to me was an act of discursive violence through dysconscious racism. Neely, as well as others, I theorize that engage in dysconscious racism, which will be explored further, are an example of how the physically violent act of maintaining whiteness and racism, such as lynching and segregation, has shifted more towards the violence of discursive and covert acts of normative whiteness, as well as structural racism and normative whiteness. Oh, I repeated that, sorry about that. So when I'm talking about physical acts of violence, I'm talking about Jim Crow days, Reconstruction, lynching. When I'm talking about more covert acts, I'm talking about policies, institutions, and structures. And I'll talk about that later in the talk. So though my pause experience was a brief example of how white talk and dysconscious racism operate in a pro-vegan space, one can also see how white talk and dysconscious racism operates within intersections of racial privilege, geopolitical status, and vegan consumer consciousness. For example, how does a distorted view of whiteness and race influence individual post-racial vegan consumer consciousness, as well as influence the vegan products advocated by pro-vegan organizations such as PETA? And by post-racial, I put that in quotations. It kind of describes someone who thinks that even though we have a black president, I guess we don't have any race problems anymore. So I put that in quotations when I say someone has a post-racial consciousness. I'm kind of being funny. Because obviously, to me, there's many problems with racism in this country. So I'm going to look at what I just put out as theory. I'm going to look at it as actual concrete examples. In 2005, pro-vegan organization PETA launched an extremely controversial campaign paralleling the root causes of human suffering to the same causes as non-human animal suffering. They think that it's the same as racism, sexism, and classism. And that what they have in common is that it's othering a sentient being and then dominating that being. Their campaign did not only rely on text to convey their message, it employed the use of images of human genocide and slavery, and placed these images next to non-human animal suffering. Some of the images used were that of black people in slavery and black men having been lynched. In response to certain black Americans who found the campaign images to be racist and a reflection of white privilege, PETA's president, Ingrid Newkirk, who was a white racialized woman, wrote, quote, "We're all animals, so get over it," end quote. Applying Joyce King's theory of how whites distort their significance of the racialized experience of non-white people, her response is a reflection of her own dysconscious racism, as well as a white privilege relationship with a socio-historical and socio-spatial construction of the Eurocentric concept of animal. Now, since the social construction of race during European colonialism, to be white has meant that one is not an animal, in the colonial sense of the word. However, black people in the USA collectively equate being called an animal or equating one's suffering to an animal with the negative European colonial connotation of the word animal, which paralleled African peoples to a subhuman social position deserving of slavery and torture. In his book, The Wretched of the Earth, Frantz Fanon mentions numerous times how colonized black people were dehumanized and are perceived as being animals. Decades of such colonial abuse have constructed a present-day collective black consciousness that is constantly on edge, enraged, and always fighting to prove to the white-dominant neo-colonial system that one is human and not an animal. And I put that in quotations. One of the most intriguing aspects of Newkirk's response is that it implies that the black people who found the campaign to be racist were A, simply being specious, and B, are the real impediment to animal liberation in a cruelty-free world. Her response does not consider the possibility that African Americans who found the campaign to be racist can still be pro-vegetarian, pro-vegan, as well as supporters of animal liberation. For vegetarian law professor Angela P. Harris, who does not eat animals, she argues that it is not the animal liberation content of the campaign that is necessarily inappropriate, but the context of how it was used and why. She's a black identified woman. She writes, quote, "Animals, and for African Americans, especially primates, activate, I think, this urge to disassociate on the part of people of color based on the intuition that our dignity is always provisional. PETA's animal liberation campaigns, from this vantage point, are white. They assume a comfort in associating oneself with animals and animal issues that people of color can only assume with difficulty." And she says, "I have a visceral repulsion reaction to primates that I believe to be in part race-based, the fear of being seen by whites as interchangeable with them. It is, of course, the opposition between woman and prostitute, animal, and African that needs itself to be destroyed. But to assume that this opposition identification is unproblematic, as the dreaded comparison does, is to implicitly encode the campaign itself as white, end quote. Harris and others who find the PETA campaign to be from a white vantage point argue that the message implies this following narrative. Black people did not have full or equal rights to and suffered because of that. However, the Civil Rights Act has passed, but now non-human animals currently suffer the same way that Black Americans used to. It is nuanced and subtle, but such framing implies that Black Americans suffering from racism and white supremacy is now a thing of the past, and that the context of the campaign can't be racist because real racism manifests as physical violence, such as slavery, lynching, and segregation. Furthermore, in regard to race, disconsciousness as a denial of or refusal to acknowledge the benefits that whites enjoy at the expense of blacks may bear little resemblance to the violent bigotry and overt white supremacist ideologies of previous eras, yet still takes for granted a system of racial privilege and social stratification that favors whites. Newkirk's response is a subtle example of Dysconscious racism because she completely dismisses the validity of racialized pain and suffering of those who sincerely interpreted the campaign through the lens of critical race consciousness and through their own visceral experience with being recipients of racism and negatively animalized. While it is made clear that the Black people offended by the campaign acknowledge that they feel this way because of the socio-historical context of being racialized as and living as Black in the USA, not once does Newkirk suggest, for instance, well, as a white woman who has never experienced the anti-Black racism you're talking about, maybe that is why it doesn't bother me to say we're all animals. Maybe my consciousness is a product of being racialized and classed as a white middle-class woman in the USA. Yes, we are all animals, but I am still a white racialized human animal whose pro-vegan stance has been shaped by being an animal with a white racialized consciousness. That's what I wish she would have said that. She didn't say that. Now that you have the theoretical context and background, what I want to do for this talk is to show how such a dysconscious racist attitude manifests in the way that particular vegan products are advocated by PETA as cruelty-free. My analysis will take the phenomenon of the PETA campaign that Harris outlines as a white framing of animal rights and show how it extends to a white framing of particular vegan products advocated by PETA. So this next section I'm going to begin with a quote. It's from PETA's shopping guide page online. It's never been easier or tastier to give your kitchen a cruelty-free makeover. Major health food chains chock full of animal-friendly fare are popping up everywhere, and mainstream supermarkets have become meccas for followers of meat and dairy-free diets. The best part, with PETA's shopping guide, you don't have to strain your eyes, end quote. The above is an excerpt from PETA's website page, the Vegan Shopping Guide. It is catered toward people who want to transition into veganism, but are unable to figure out how to navigate the animal product-centric space of most grocery stores in the USA. The purpose of the guide is to recreate one's supposed cruelty-centric kitchen space into a cruelty-free kitchen space. This beginner guide has no doubt helped many omnivores map out their grocery store into a vegan-friendly walk. It has helped to dispel the myth and stereotype that being vegan means one has too few food options. However, if we were to look beyond the fact that PETA-approved foods contain no animal products, which equals cruelty-free to PETA, and look at how this particular guide is framed, we can see that the transparency to divulge what are animal-free products is contingent upon making invisible the human cruelty that has gone into the making of these products. The new vegan consumer is led to believe that to create a cruelty-free world is a one-dimensional consumer act that simply involves buying PETA pre-approved vegan foods. As soon as the money is handed over to the cashier for an exchange of vegan goods, one need not think any further about the concept of cruelty-free. Their consumer choice to go vegan is enough, and they are on their way to making their kitchen cruelty-free. However, what is missing from PETA's transparent list of cruelty-free items are the human beings that make the existence of many vegan products even possible. PETA's long list of vegan-approved foods come from many huge corporations that don't have a stellar track record when it comes to their treatment of human beings, such as Nestle and Hershey. There is no transparency to the person using this shopping guide what it even means when vegan foods are corporatized by companies that are focused more on the profiting off of the new vegan movement than focusing on the ethical basis of the movement. Hence, profit margins frequently mean that corporations will pay little attention to how their vegan ingredients are sourced and who may suffer along the commodity chain to produce these supposed cruelty-free products. Though PETA does proclaim itself to be dedicated to reducing animal suffering and making transparent how animals suffer for human gratification, the shopping guide fails to engage their supporters to think beyond animal exploitation. On their produce shopping guide section, PETA has written, quote, "It's easy as apple pie to get your 5 a day when you eat a vegetarian diet. Fruits and vegetables are great sources of essential vitamins, minerals, and antioxidants," end quote. Yes, it appears to be obvious that produce is by default cruelty-free of animal products. However, what is not being made transparent is how most vegans in the USA who follow this guide have access to produce that comes from exploited, non-white, racialized, and poor human laborers. There is a huge discrepancy between those who can afford and get transportation access to a diverse variety of produce versus those who cannot. The former are largely white, middle to upper class people. The latter are non-white and low-income minority populations. Not only are the latter collectively unable to get access to a diverse variety of produce, they are the very people who work within the most underpaid, unequal, and dangerous spaces of food production that ensure the average vegan consumer following PETA's guide can have a quote-unquote cruelty-free kitchen. Granted, PETA has never claimed that their pro-vegan rhetoric should look beyond the one-dimensional issue of animal liberation, so I'm not implying that they failed to do something that I said is part of their goal. However, their sense of a vegan food guide, when analyzed through a critical race and decolonial feminist world systems analysis, reveals their guide to be a neoliberal, white, and middle-class framing of food consumption in general. PETA's vegan shopping guide ignores how structural racism, sexism, poverty, supported by neoliberal concepts of social justice, make it easy as pie to get your 5 servings of fruits or vegetables. Though this is only a small sample, here is PETA's list of cruelty-free and vegan-approved foods. Amy's spinach pizza, Amy's roasted vegetable pizza, Moosewood Mediterranean tomato and rice soup, Tofutti pizza pizzazz, and Eve's veggie pizza pepperoni. What these products all have in common is the ingredient of the tomato. Now, North America's access to tomatoes rely mostly on the labor of poor non-white females, many who worked in the most environmentally toxic and inhumane conditions to bring tomatoes to North America. However, to understand the implications of North Americans having access to fresh tomatoes and products made from tomatoes all year round, it is important to understand the intensive multi-layered genealogy of the tomato's roots in Mexico. European colonialism, imperialism, and capitalism destroyed the culture and biodiversity of the indigenous people's land base and livelihood in Mexico. Over time, and since European colonialism, the European colonizers forcibly removed the indigenous people of Mexico from their land, leaving most of them with only one option for survival: working for unlivable wages and relying on foods that are imported to them from the USA for their own sustenance. NAFTA would also come to exacerbate problems of inequality and exploitation of indigenous populations, making it possible for North Americans to have access to tomatoes all year long. NAFTA is a form of structural racism, sexism, poverty matrix, which maintains the system of cheap labor and cheap tomatoes. In the chapter, Teaching Race and Racism in the 21st Century, Howard Winnett writes that NAFTA and the WTO are newer and ever-expanding mechanisms to help achieve global economic power for the USA, which, quote, began to cast transnational political economic issues in a newly racialized mold. This process reached the new heights at the 2001 UN World Conference on Racism in Durban, South Africa, where the US did its best to undermine and marginalize demand for global racial justice, end quote. Within the social historical context of European and American colonialism, imperialism, To undermine global racial justice means that it is still permissible to enslave and exploit non-white racialized people for the economic and social interests of a largely modern white middle to upper class Western demographic and white elite male corporate interests. The lack of the vegan shopping guide's critical engagement beyond non-human animal exploitation completely elides the significance of structural racism, sexism, poverty matrix for such vegan commodities as tomatoes. For example, mestizos in Mexico are paid nearly 10 times more than indigenous people because the national narrative of Mexico has defined indigenous people as inferior and subhuman. And for those who don't know, mestizos are the lighter-skinned people who look closer to Europeans. Now, such a rationale legitimizes why it is acceptable in the government and industry's eyes that the indigenous people who pick tomatoes can be given poverty-level wages and literally have to reside in shanty communities with no clean running water, electricity, and other basic human needs. Within the context of structural racism, sexism, and poverty matrix, NAFTA is an example of sustaining an underlying narrative that there are permissible spaces of racialized class suffering and there are unacceptable spaces of racialized class suffering. I speak a lot about space because I'm a geographer, so that's why I talk a lot about place and space. Now, it is not a stretch to theorize that the reason PETA's cruelty-free vegan shopping guide does not fully educate vegan newbies about the human spaces in which their foods come from is because there is a deeply dysconscious acceptance by PETA that it is normal for certain racialized class human beings, such as indigenous Mexicans, to harvest tomatoes in inhumane conditions to make vegan pizza possible. Simultaneously, the vegan cheese pizza that the guide advocates suggests that it is not acceptable that cows suffer in farming spaces to produce milk for dairy cheese pizza. Advocating vegan cheese pizza as cruelty-free allows PETA to be consciously anti-specious while disconsciously unquestioning of the racist spaces and economic policies such as NAFTA that make so many vegan commodities possible. Returning to my pause experience at Princeton, I argue that their dismissal of the pertinence of race and the continuing significance of racism within animal liberation and pro-vegan logic is also about the lack of recognition of what Frantz Fanon refers to as the colonial condition and lived experience of being black. Though Fanon's work was specific to black Algerians during colonialism, the content of his theory can be extended to the current day lived experiences of those living on the underside of modernity, such as the indigenous human beings picking vegan tomatoes, the Uzbekistani children who harvest vegan cotton, and the indentured Haitians harvesting vegan cane sugar for our products. Sorry, trying to call. Existing in spaces of coloniality as the wretched of the earth produces a consciousness that is absolutely antithetical to those who have an anti-specious and dysconscious racist framework. It throws a wrench in the latter's preconceived logic of why their version of veganism is cruelty-free. I would also further argue that it isn't that many vegans of the status quo in the USA are unable to comprehend the significance of racism, as much as they are unwilling to forsake their racial class and first world privileged human-animal experience. What is attractive about the one-dimensional, it's only about the animals, or you're racializing the purity of morals and ethics mentalities amongst those with dysconscious racism, is that they can give up their specious privilege without having to give up their white racial class and first world consumption privileges. It would appear that addiction to the power and privilege of neoliberal whiteness is far harder to give up than addiction to the power and privilege of consuming non-human animals. On their snacks page guide, PETA advocates over 150 cruelty-free snacks, including Nestle double chocolate Thin Mints. Nestle will not disclose transparency to its consumers, the source of their cocoa, and as of 2004, was sourcing cocoa from West African child labor. And these children are actually abducted and forced to produce cocoa, harvest cocoa for the global West. In addition, Nestle, among others such as PepsiCo and Coca-Cola, are notoriously anti-union and continue to undermine workers' rights. Labor leaders and organizers have been attacked, kidnapped, and killed in developing countries such as Colombia and Guatemala. However, PETA does advocate products from corporations such as Newman's Organic and Nature's Path who are semi-conscious of sourcing slavery-free cocoa. But it is unclear if they do this because PETA is conscious of human slavery issues or because someone simply found that these products have no animal ingredients in them, so let's slap them on the list. However, the overall list of foods in this guide that have ingredients that rely on human exploitation far outnumber the ingredients sourced by companies who take seriously whether or not their products and ingredients are as human cruelty-free as possible. Now, it must be made clear that this is not a critique of vegan people who buy these products. The focus of my analysis is the implication of what it means that new vegans aren't even made aware of the human injustices that make it possible for a cruelty-free kitchen. Now, many pro-vegan activists and organizations, such as PETA, have fought to make transparent the spaces of unacceptable suffering that non-human animals go through. Stated earlier, I know it's not PETA's intent to do more than reveal what products are animal-free and which are not. However, for the world's most powerful and well-funded pro-vegan organization to virtually ignore the human cruelty component of the vegan products they advocate must be noted. It is this white, middle-class, and neoliberal framing and advocacy of a particular type of vegan consumption that I am making visible, particularly because it so vividly reflects co-founder Newkirk's response, "We're all animals, get over it." However, there is a pro-vegan food justice organization that offers an example of how to advocate vegan products within the framework of a critical consciousness around racism and issues of power within a neoliberal and globalized capitalist economic system. And that organization is called the Food Empowerment Project, coming out of San Jose, California. I'm not going to sneeze. Okay. So I begin this section with the below quote from the website page from FEP, or the Food Empowerment Project. It is from the page Importing Slavery. Quote, "Despite increasing pressure from the international community, conditions of slavery remain prevalent in the production of large-scale food exports such as sugar and beef. In part, this is due to the lack of oversight and regulation by local governments. They know exploitative conditions exist, but they don't want to compromise their place in the world market." And further down they write, "Food Empowerment Project believes it is important for everyone to be aware of the fact that the U.S. imports products of slavery, so when opportunities arise, we can be prepared to help stop it," end quote. A pro-vegan organization, Food Empowerment Project, which I will refer to as FEP, is a model of what critical race and class consciousness within pro-vegan organizations can look like. The above quote is concerned with how humans and how non-human animals are trapped in slavery conditions within the chain of a food production system, from the local to the global. On page 2 of FEP's shopping guide brochure, they write, quote, "We encourage healthy food choices that reflect a more compassionate society by spotlighting the abuse of animals on farms, the depletion of natural resources, unfair working conditions for produce workers, and the unavailability of healthy foods in low-income areas," end quote. And what's interesting, the difference between PETA and FEP is that PETA was started by a white middle-class woman, and FEP was started by a Latina or Chicana woman in California. So by default, this is their racialized gender experience. You can kind of see why one went one way and one went the other way in terms of kind of existing through USA in a country where if you are a woman of color, most likely you get it from the start that the world is not based on meritocracy and you can't usually just buy your way into justice. There are certain factors such as racism and sexism and class that you have to be wary of and concerned with. Now, similarly to PETA, FEP tells readers to go vegan, but the reasons for why and how are different than PETA's vegan shopping guide strategy. FEP asks people to go vegan because of animal compassion. compassion. However, they ask people to think critically about how to pursue vegan-oriented consumption, since the chain of food production is wrought with the cruel treatment of not just non-human animals, but human beings as well as the environment. And they write, quote, "The Food Empowerment Project encourages a vegan lifestyle based on compassion and respect for all forms of life. It is vital that our compassion and respect extend not only to the animals who are so poorly mistreated, but also to the workers who provide us with the fruits and vegetables that sustain us. As consumers, we can promote social justice and equality by supporting farms that value and respect their workers." FEP's guide to encompass a pro-vegan philosophy into one's food praxis makes transparent the cruelty of racism, poverty, and sexism that make just about all USA food, vegan or not, possible. This is the fundamental difference between PETA's Vegan Shopping Guide and FEP's. For example, while PETA's Vegan Shopping Guide never once mentions the child slavery involved in most cocoa harvesting, FEP provides a list of chocolate products that they have researched to make sure that they are as both animal and human cruelty-free as possible. While PETA recommends Hershey's baking cocoa, FEP states on page 10 of their pamphlet, quote, "The plantations of West Africa supply cocoa to such confectionery giants as Hershey's, Mars, and Nestle, revealing the industry's direct connection to slavery, child labor, and human trafficking. Food Empowerment Project recommends that consumers not buy any chocolate sourced from Africa," end quote. End quote. This is quite significant, as it positions the reader to realize that though they can buy vegan chocolate, such a product does not guarantee a cruelty-free chain of production. In addition, FEP urges people to take a pro-vegan philosophy that recognizes that not everyone has easy food access due to factors such as food deserts, a form of environmental racism which makes it incredibly difficult for low-income and many non-white racialized people to even have access to healthier and diverse foods, vegan or not. FEP does not assume that everyone has a white and middle-class relationship with food access. However, this assumption is implied in PETA's Vegan Shopping Guide when they say that going vegan is easy as apple pie. Well, easy for who? What makes healthier vegan food access easier for one population over another? FEP answers these questions on their produce workers and environmental racism pages. They explain that not only do poor non-whites, mostly Mexicans, make up a significant portion of those who harvest produce in the USA, many don't even have access to the foods that are easy to get in PETA's Vegan Shopping Guide. On their produce workers page, FEP writes, quote, "After a long day, most workers go home to run down housing structures that are unsanitary and often unsafe. They struggle to provide adequate nutrition for themselves and their children. In many cases, workers are unable to afford the very foods they labor to produce. Considering that the average field worker has a 6th grade education, the children of field workers have little hope of going to college or even finishing high school. The vast majority of families will never have the opportunity to break the cycle of poverty." End quote. Furthermore, FEP explains that a significant number of low-income and communities of color simply do not have access to healthier food options, as these communities are overrun by liquor stores, fast food restaurants, and convenience stores. Corporations strategically target these low-income and communities of color, capitalizing off of their low-income situation and/or the racialized, uneven development that has created spaces, such as food deserts located in Black ghettos or Native American reservations, for example. Despite the plethora of scholarly literature out there that shows how such environmental racisms continue to be connected to racialized health disparities and unequal access to healthier food options, it is interesting that PETA's Vegan Shopping Guide completely silences and uncritically promotes vegan, It is interesting that PETA's Vegan Shopping Guide completely elides and uncritically promotes vegan products by the very corporations who target marginalized populations with their unhealthy food products. Granted, PETA never writes that they want to focus on these elements, but the mere fact that they don't even write in their guide that it is something buyers should be aware of is noteworthy. To completely leave out these elements of the food chain and food access positions vegan consumption promoted by PETA as embedded in neoliberalism, white middle class common sense point of view. As a matter of fact, the pathology of neoliberal whiteness is so part of ordinary everyday life in the USA, it is rendered invisible, while the consumption of animals and animal byproducts are visibly centered as a pathological problem in the framing of PETA's vegan shopping guide and overall PETA website. As of October 2011, typing the words racism, whiteness, NAFTA, colonialism, classism, and racialized into the search tool of PETA's cruelty-free living and literature site archives,